The dress was mine before it was ever supposed to be anyone else's.
And I was standing at the edge of my sister's engagement party, watching her twirl in it under string lights, while my mother told 40 guests that I was too practical to need romance. Celeste spun once, twice, the ivory silk mikado catching the light exactly the way I had engineered it to catch light.
Because I was the one who had cut that bias seam, who had spent 4 months of Tuesday nights hand-sewing the boning channels until my fingertips split. My mother stood beside her with a glass of Prosecco, beaming at the crowd like she had personally spun the thread from silkworms.
"Mara doesn't need a dress like this," Vivian said, loud enough that the whole tented backyard could hear her over the string quartet. "She's the practical one."
Celeste is the one who dreams. I stood near the dessert table, holding a small plate of pralines I had no intention of eating. And I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very cold, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm siren. If you have ever had something you built with your own hands handed to someone else, like it was never yours to begin with, tell me where you are watching from, and stay a moment, because this story does not end the way my mother thought it would. My name is Mara Ellison. I am 32 years old, and I make costumes for a regional theater company in Savannah, Georgia. The kind of work where nobody in the audience ever sees my name, but everybody notices if a corset seam pops during a dance number. I have spent a decade learning to build garments the way a carpenter learns to build a house that will not fall down in a storm. From the inside out, bone by bone, seam by seam. I tell you this because it matters for what happened later, at that party, under those string lights. When a woman who runs a bridal salon opened a hidden seam and read my name out loud. But to understand why that moment cracked something open in my family, you have to understand what came before it. Because the dress was not the beginning of the story. The dress was the last thing my mother took. The first thing I remember losing to Celeste was smaller, almost embarrassing to admit. I was 9 and she was 6, and I had a music box shaped like a swan that our grandmother gave me for my birthday. Celeste cried at a family dinner because she wanted it. And my mother took it from my dresser while I was at school and wrapped it for Celeste's birthday 2 weeks later. When I asked where it went, Vivian said, "You're older, Mara. You understand sharing better than she does." I did not understand sharing. I understood that the swan was gone, and that my crying about it made me look selfish, and that my sister's crying made her look sensitive. I learned that lesson early, and it never really left me. The second thing was a scholarship application folder, blue, dog-eared, sitting on the kitchen counter the summer I turned 17. I had applied for a design apprenticeship in Atlanta, one that could have set the whole direction of my career. And my mother used the application fee money from my savings envelope to pay for Celeste's dance recital costume instead, telling me, "Celeste has a recital in 3 weeks, Mara. Your deadline isn't for another month. You'll figure it out." I did figure it out, working 3 extra shifts at a diner to cover the fee myself. And I made the deadline with $4 left in my checking account. Nobody in my family ever asked how that turned out. Nobody asked if I got in. I did. The third object was a hope chest, cedar with brass hinges, that my great-aunt left me specifically in her will, addressed to me by name. Meant to be filled with things for my future home. Vivian moved it into Celeste's room the year Celeste got engaged the first time, before that engagement fell apart, saying, "It makes more sense in there, honey. You're not even seeing anyone." The chest stayed in Celeste's room for 3 years. I never asked for it back. I told myself it did not matter, that objects do not matter, that it was petty to care about a piece of furniture. I was wrong about that. But I did not know it yet.
The fourth object was an invoice, folded into quarters, tucked into my wallet for almost a year from Silk Row Fabrics on Whitaker Street. Itemizing 4.5 yards of ivory silk mikado, 3 yards of French Alencon lace, and a spool of silk-covered boning. All purchased on a Thursday afternoon in October, all paid for with my own debit card, because I had decided, quietly, privately, without telling anyone, that if I was ever going to get married, I was going to make my own dress. Not because I could not afford one, because building things with my hands is how I say the things I cannot say out loud. That invoice sat in my wallet like a secret, and I liked it there. The fifth object was a corkboard in my sewing room, covered in sketches, sleeve variations, neckline studies, and a single photograph of a 1940s couture gown from a museum archive that I used as my inspiration reference. I spent 2 months just drafting the pattern before I ever touched fabric, because a pattern maker's job is patience. And I have always had more patience with cloth than with people. My mother walked past that corkboard once, glanced at it, and said, "Is that for a show?" I said yes, because it was easier than explaining that it was for me, for a future I had not built yet, for a wedding I had not been invited to plan by anyone but myself. The sixth object was a fitting appointment card from Alvarez Bridal Alterations on Broughton Street, stamped 4 separate times across 4 separate months, because I had brought the half-finished dress to Mrs. Alvarez for structural fittings, not because I needed her to sew it, but because she had 30 years of experience shaping boning channels, and I wanted a second set of hands to check my work. She remembered every appointment. She remembered because I came alone every single time, and because I always asked the same question at the end of each fitting. Does it hang right without anyone standing behind it? She told me later that question stuck with her, because most brides ask if it makes them look thin. And I only ever asked if it could stand on its own. The seventh object was a spool of pale gold thread, unremarkable to anyone else, that I used to hand embroider a small maker's label, my name and the year, and stitch it into the inner waist stay of the dress, hidden under a panel of gross grain ribbon where no one would ever see it, unless they knew exactly where to look. I did this the way a furniture maker signs the underside of a drawer, not for glory, for proof, for myself, that the thing existed because I made it exist. The eighth object was my phone, lighting up on a Tuesday night in March with a text from my mother in the family group chat. A chat that included me, Celeste, and our Aunt Ruth. The message read, "Celeste's engagement party is in 6 weeks, and we need to talk about her dress for the big reveal. I have an idea." I did not think much of it at the time. I assumed she meant a shopping trip. I did not yet understand that my mother had already decided whose dress it would be. The pivot for me came on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks before the party, when Vivian called me into her kitchen and asked me, very casually, while she was chopping celery for a pot of soup, whether the dress in my sewing room was finished or not. I told her it was nearly finished, that I had one more fitting scheduled with Mrs. Alvarez to check the hem. She nodded slowly, still chopping, and said, "Good. I think Celeste should wear it at her party. It would mean so much to her. And honestly, Mara, it's family fabric, isn't it? We're all family." I stood very still in that kitchen doorway, and something in me that had been bending quietly for 20 years finally stopped bending. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry, though I wanted to. I said, "It's not family fabric, Mom. I bought it. I made it. It's mine." My mother set down the knife, wiped her hands on a dish towel,
and said the sentence that would echo in my head for weeks afterward.
You don't need it the way she does, honey. You're the practical one.
She's the one who dreams about these things. That was the moment I stopped pleading and started counting.
I went home that night, and I did not cry into a pillow the way I might have at 22. I sat down at my sewing table with a legal pad, and I made a list. The way I make a materials list before I cut into expensive fabric. Because mistakes with expensive fabric are unforgiving, and I have learned to never work without a plan. I wrote down the date I purchased the silk. I wrote down the 4 fitting dates at Alvarez Bridal Alterations. I wrote down the location of the hidden label in the waist stay. I photographed the dress from every angle, hanging on its form, including a close-up of the inner waistband before I resealed the grosgrain panel over the label. I photographed the original pattern pieces, still folded in their archive box in my closet, each piece labeled in my own handwriting, with notches and grain lines that matched, stitch for stitch, the finished garment. I called Mrs. Alvarez the next morning, not to ask her opinion on my family, but to ask a factual question. If someone else wore this dress to an event, I said, would you be able to identify it as one you fitted for me specifically? She did not hesitate. Mara, I have fitted hundreds of brides. I remember the ones who come alone and ask hard questions. I remember your dress. I have 4 fitting sheets with your name and your measurements on them. And I remember exactly where you asked me to reinforce the waist stay. I asked her to keep those fitting sheets somewhere safe. She said she already kept every fitting sheet for 7 years, as a matter of salon policy, in case of alterations disputes. That was the first piece of my evidence trail, and I had not even had to build it. It already existed, because a professional woman had done her job carefully for 30 years. I did not tell my mother any of this. I let her believe I had accepted the arrangement, because a woman who has spent her whole life being underestimated learns, eventually, that being underestimated can be a strategic advantage. 2 weeks before the party, Celeste came to my apartment unannounced, sat on my couch, and told me she was so excited. That Mom had shown her a photo of the dress, and it was literally the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. And did I mind, really? Truly mind. Because if I minded, she would say something to Mom. I looked at my sister, 29 years old, sitting in my living room, asking permission to take something that was never offered to her honestly in the first place. And I said, would it change anything if I said I minded? Celeste looked away and said, Mom already told everyone it's happening. It would be so awkward now. I understood then that I was not being asked a real question. I was being given the appearance of consent so that later, when this all came apart, everyone could say I had agreed. I called Mrs. Alvarez again and asked if she still had my dress, since it had been dropped off with her salon for a final steaming and press before the party. Arranged, ironically, by my own mother, who assumed the dress was simply the family dress now and had every right to send it wherever she liked. Mrs. Alvarez confirmed she had it, hanging in the back fitting room, tagged under my name, exactly as it had been tagged during every fitting. I asked her one more thing. If I asked you, in front of people, to open the inner waist stay and read what's stitched inside it, would you do that? There was a pause on the line, and then she said, Mara, I have been doing this work for 30 years. I have seen families do a lot of things to each other over a piece of cloth. If you're asking me to tell the truth about a garment I fitted with my own hands, yes, I will do that. If you have ever had to quietly build your own proof while everyone around you assumed you would just stay quiet, drop a comment with one word, still here, so I know you are with me for this part. The night of the engagement party arrived warm and heavy with jasmine, the kind of Savannah evening where the air itself seems to slow everything down. My mother had rented a small event space behind a restaurant on the river, string lights strung between oak trees, round tables dressed in white linen. 40 or so guests, including Aunt Ruth, several of Celeste's co-workers, our second cousins, and my mother's book club friends, all gathered to celebrate Celeste's engagement to a man named Tomas, who I liked well enough, and who, I would later learn, had absolutely no idea whose dress his fiancée was wearing. I arrived early, at my mother's request, to help with setup, which turned out to mean helping carry boxes, while Vivian directed a florist and periodically checked her phone for updates from the salon about the dress delivery. At one point, she turned to me and said, "Isn't this exciting? It's going to be such a beautiful surprise for everyone." I said nothing. I had already called Mrs. M. Alvarez that morning and confirmed she would personally deliver the dress herself, rather than sending an assistant, because I had asked her to, and because she had agreed without asking why. The reveal was staged the way my mother stages everything, with maximum theater and minimum honesty. After dinner, after the toasts, after Tomas's father made a joke about finally getting a daughter-in-law who could cook better than his son, my mother stood up with a microphone borrowed from the restaurant's sound system and announced that Celeste had a surprise for everyone. Celeste disappeared into a side room with two of her bridesmaids, and 5 minutes later, she emerged in the dress. My dress! The silk catching the string lights exactly as I had known it would, because I had built it to catch light. The guests gasped, the way guests are trained to gasp at these moments, and Celeste twirled once in the center of the small dance floor, laughing, her hands smoothing the silk at her hips. My mother took the microphone again and said the words I opened the story with, the words that landed in my chest like a dropped pin. Mara doesn't need a dress like this. She's the practical one. Celeste is the one who dreams. A few guests laughed politely, not understanding the weight of what had just been said. Not understanding that practical was the word my mother had used my entire life to mean not worth investing in. I set down my praline plate on the dessert table. Very carefully, the way you set down something you do not want to break. And I walked toward the small stage area where Celeste was still turning slowly for photographs. I did not raise my voice. I have learned that raised voices give people permission to dismiss you as emotional, and I did not intend to be dismissed. "Mom," I said, loud enough to carry, but not to shout, "can I say something before the toast?" My mother, still holding the microphone, smiled the tight smile she uses when she senses she is losing control of a room, and said, "Of course, honey, but let's keep it short. We still have the cake." I turned to the guests, most of whom had gone quiet, sensing the shift in the air, the way people at parties always do right before something real happens. "I want to say congratulations to Celeste and Tomas," I said. "And I want everyone here to know something about the dress." I felt my mother's eyes on me, sharp now, no longer performing warmth. This dress was designed and hand-sewn over 4 months by a pattern maker. I know because I hired her. I paused. I am the pattern maker. I bought the silk myself in October. I have the invoice. I did every fitting myself at a salon on Broughton Street. And there is a maker's label stitched into the inner waiststay of this dress because that is standard professional practice. And because I wanted proof that I built it. The room did the thing rooms do when a truth lands sideways into a carefully arranged lie. A kind of collective stillness, glasses paused halfway to mouths, forks resting on plates. My mother's smile did not fully drop, but it thinned into something brittle.
"Mara, this isn't the time," she said into the microphone, her voice tightening.
"This is Celeste's night. Why are you doing this now in front of everyone?" "Because you did this in front of everyone," I said. "You told 40 people I don't need romance, standing next to a dress I built stitch by stitch for my own future. I think everyone deserves to know the truth about what they're looking at." Vivian's counterattack came fast, the way it always does when she feels cornered in public. Because my mother has never lost an argument by staying calm. She has only ever won them by escalating faster than the other person can follow. "You're embarrassing your sister on her engagement night," she said, her voice rising, pitched for the crowd now rather than for me. "This is exactly what I mean about you, Mara. Everything has to be about you and your feelings. Can't you just be happy for her, just this once, without making it a competition?" A murmur moved through the guests, some of them nodding slightly, sympathetic to my mother's framing, because that is how effective her framing has always been, turning my grief into my selfishness in the space of a single sentence. Celeste, still standing under the string lights in my dress, looked between us, her face flushing, clearly torn between defending her mother and beginning, just barely, to understand what she was wearing. I did not raise my voice to match my mother's. I said, calmly, "I'm not trying to make it a competition, Mom. I'm asking for the truth to be told. And I brought someone who can tell it better than I can." I turned toward the entrance of the tent, where Mrs. Alvarez had been standing quietly near the catering table for the last 10 minutes, exactly where I had asked her to wait. Holding a small sewing kit in her hands, the way another woman might hold a clutch purse. If you think the truth deserves to be spoken even when it ruins someone's carefully planned evening, tell me in the comments where this story is landing for you, because we are almost to the part where the label gets read out loud. Mrs. Alvarez walked forward with the calm authority of a woman who has spent 30 years handling other people's most emotionally loaded garments and has learned to treat all of them with the same steady professionalism. She did not look at my mother. She looked at Celeste, gently, the way you look at a bride who does not yet know what is about to happen to her dress. "Celeste, honey," she said, "would you mind stepping over here for just a moment? I need to check something on the inner waist stay. It will only take a second." Celeste, bewildered, glanced at my mother, who had gone rigid. The microphone still clutched in her hand, though she had stopped speaking into it. "Mom, what is she talking about?" Celeste asked. Vivian said quickly, too quickly, "It's nothing. It's probably just a loose thread. Let her check it after the toast." But Mrs. Alvarez was already kneeling slightly at Celeste's waist, her fingers finding the inner grosgrain panel with the ease of someone who had sewn that exact panel into place herself, months earlier, in her own fitting room, with me standing beside the mirror. "There's a panel here," Mrs. Alvarez said, loud enough now for the nearby tables to hear, her voice carrying the flat, unhurried authority of expertise rather than drama. "It's stitched down with a simple whip stitch. Easy to open, easy to reseal. Most brides never even know it's there. It's where we tuck growth allowances, alteration notes." She looked up, briefly, at my mother, then back down at the fabric. "And sometimes maker's labels." She unpicked the whip stitch with a small seam ripper from her kit, 4 quick motions, and folded back the grosgrain panel to reveal a strip of pale gold thread embroidered directly into the lining. Small, neat, unmistakably hand-done. She read it aloud, clearly, into the quiet tent, her voice carrying to every table without needing the microphone at all. "Ms. Ellison. Made by hand. October." The silence that followed was different from the earlier stillness.
This silence had weight to it, the kind that makes people look down at their plates or glance sideways at their neighbors. Because everyone in that tent had just watched a lie get physically opened up and read out loud in a woman's own handwriting, stitched into silk. Celeste's face went pale, then red, her hands moving instinctively to cover the exposed panel at her waist, as though she could push the truth back inside the fabric.
"Mom," Celeste said, her voice small now, stripped of the earlier joy. "You told me Mara said it was fine. You told me she gave it to us." My mother's mouth opened, but for the first time that evening, nothing theatrical came out of it. She looked at me, then at Mrs. Alvarez.
Then at the small gathered crowd of guests who were no longer looking at Celeste's dress with admiration, but with the particular discomfort of people who have just realized they were props in someone else's performance.
"I never said that exactly," Vivian finally managed. "I said it was a family dress, and Mara understood that we're all family, that things get shared." "I never agreed to anything," I said. "I told you in your kitchen that it was mine. You didn't ask me again after that. You just decided."
Aunt Ruth, who had been sitting quietly at a nearby table through the entire exchange, stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the patio stones, and said, in the dry, unhurried voice she has used my whole life to say things nobody else in the family will say, "Vivian, I watched that girl sew that dress for 4 months at your own kitchen table half the time because her apartment doesn't have good light in the evenings. You knew whose it was." Everybody at this table who's been paying attention knew whose it was. A few guests nodded again, but this time the nodding was aimed at my mother, not at me, and I watched something in Vivian's posture crumple slightly, the performance finally running out of air. Mrs. Alvarez, still kneeling, looked up at Celeste with the gentle practicality of a professional who has navigated 100 awkward moments in bridal fittings and knows how to move a room forward without cruelty. "Celeste, sweetheart, I think the kindest thing right now is for you to step out of this dress and let it go back to the person whose name is stitched into it. We can find you something lovely for photos, I promise, but this one was never really yours to keep." Celeste did not argue. She turned, walked back toward the side room, with her bridesmaids trailing behind her, and returned a few minutes later in the simple slip dress she had apparently worn underneath for comfort, the borrowed silk gown draped carefully over Mrs. Alvarez's arm like something being returned to a hospital after a loan. She handed it to me without meeting my eyes at first, and then, quietly, just to me, not into any microphone, she said, "I'm sorry, Mara. I should have asked you myself from the beginning." I let Mom tell me what was true because it was easier than finding out. I did not have a grand speech ready for that moment because grand speeches were never really the point. I said, "Thank you for saying that." It was not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. But it was the first honest sentence my sister had said to me in months. And I let it sit there between us, without rushing to fill the space with something bigger than it was. My mother did not apologize that night. Not out loud, not in front of anyone. She busied herself with the cake cutting, her voice pitched artificially bright again as she announced to the remaining guests that it was time for dessert. As though nothing had happened, as though the air in the tent had not just fundamentally shifted. I watched her do this and understood, with a kind of tired clarity, that some people do not apologize because they cannot afford to. Because the apology would require them to admit a version of themselves they have spent decades refusing to see. If you have ever watched someone refuse to apologize, even after the truth was laid out plainly in front of them,
You already know exactly how that cake-cutting moment felt.
Let me know if this has happened in your own family, too. I left the party 20 minutes later, carrying the dress folded carefully over my arm, Mrs.
Alvarez walking beside me to my car in the parking lot behind the restaurant.
"You did that with more grace than most people manage," she said, as I laid the dress across my back seat like something precious and slightly bruised. "I've seen brides scream over far smaller things than what your family did to you tonight." I told her I did not feel graceful. I felt hollow.
The way you feel after you finally set down something heavy you have been carrying for so long that your arms have forgotten how to hang normally at your sides.
She patted my shoulder and said, "That's what the quiet after comes for."
Give it a few days. The days after the party were not dramatic.
There was no second confrontation, no screaming phone calls, no dramatic family meeting around Vivian's kitchen table.
Instead, there was a kind of careful, awkward silence that settled over the family group chat, a silence I did not rush to break. Celeste texted me privately, twice, asking if we could get coffee sometime soon, and I said yes, meaning it.
Because my anger had never really been at her the way it was at Vivian, and because an apology offered privately, without an audience,
meant more to me than any public performance ever could have. We did get coffee about 10 days later at a small shop near the waterfront.
And Celeste told me she had spent the days since the party thinking about all the things she had let herself not notice over the years.
The music box, the scholarship fee, the hope chest, the dress. A small litany of objects she recited almost like a confession. I think I let myself believe Mom's version of things because it was easier than admitting she was doing something wrong, Celeste said, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking it. And I think part of me liked being the one things got given to.
I don't feel good about that now. I told her I appreciated her saying it, and I meant it, and we sat together for a while longer.
Not fixing everything, but starting something honest, which is more than I had expected from that particular sister at that particular table only 2 weeks earlier. My mother's response, when it finally came, arrived not in words, but in an envelope, mailed to my apartment rather than handed to me in person, containing a check for the cost of the silk and lace, calculated, I assume, from some rough estimate she made herself, rather than from the actual invoice I had kept folded in my wallet for a year. There was no note attached, no explanation, no apology written out in her looping handwriting. Just the check, folded once, in a plain white envelope with my name written on the front in the same hand that had once written "family fabric" into a group chat, as though 4 months of my labor could be summarized in 2 dismissive words. I did not cash the check right away. I sat with it on my kitchen counter for almost a week, looking at it every time I made coffee, trying to decide what it meant. Whether accepting it would feel like closure or like being paid off for something that was never really about money in the first place. Aunt Ruth, when I told her about it over the phone, said something that stuck with me. "Vivian doesn't know how to say sorry with her mouth, Mara. She only knows how to say it with a check, because a check doesn't require her to admit she was wrong out loud. Take the money if you want it, but don't mistake it for the apology you're actually owed. Those are 2 different things, and you deserve both eventually, even if you only get one for now." I eventually cashed the check, not because it fixed anything, but because refusing it would have cost me more than accepting it, and I have learned in 32 years of being the practical daughter that sometimes practicality means taking what is offered without pretending it is more than it is. I used part of that money, along with money I had already been quietly saving, to buy a new bolt of silk, a deeper ivory this time,
almost the color of raw cream, from the same shop on Whitaker Street, where Mrs.
Alvarez still keeps my original fitting sheets filed away in a cabinet marked with my last name. I remade the dress that autumn, in my own sewing room, alone, on my own schedule, without telling anyone in my family that I was doing it. Because this time, the dress was not for a wedding that might or might not happen someday.
And it was not for anyone's approval or anyone's twirl under string lights.
It was for me, for the simple, private satisfaction of building something correctly and keeping it, of proving to myself quietly, without an audience, that I could make a thing and it could remain mine from beginning to end. Celeste and I are not fully repaired, not the way people repair things in movies, with one big, tearful hug that fixes 20 years of small thefts in a single scene. We are repairing slowly, the way you repair a seam that has been under strain for a long time, carefully, a few stitches at a time. Checking the tension as you go, so it does not tear again somewhere else. My mother and I speak occasionally, politely, mostly about logistics, holidays, small updates about work. And I have stopped waiting for the apology Aunt Ruth said I was owed, not because I no longer want it, but because I have learned that waiting for it was its own kind of quiet suffering. And I am tired of suffering quietly for things other people are unwilling to say. Mrs. Alvarez still calls me sometimes when she has a difficult fitting she wants a second opinion on, and I go. Because I trust her hands, and because there is a particular kind of friendship that forms between two women who have handled the same silk under the same difficult lights and told the truth about it anyway. She once told me that in 30 years of bridal work, she had unpicked a lot of seams. But she had never forgotten the sound of a room going quiet the way that tent went quiet when she read my name out loud. And she said it with something like pride, as though she had been honored to be the one holding the seam ripper that night. The dress I made the second time hangs now in my closet at home, not in a garment bag from a bridal shop, but on a simple wooden hanger I carved myself in a woodworking class I took the following spring. Mostly because I wanted to learn to make things with a different set of tools for once. I have not worn it anywhere. I am not sure I ever will, and I have made a kind of uneasy peace with that uncertainty. Because I have come to understand that the value of the dress was never really about the wedding it might someday attend. The value was in the making, in the hundreds of small, careful decisions that went into every seam. Decisions no one else in my family ever noticed or thought to ask about. On the small work table in my sewing room, beside the closet where the second dress hangs, there sits a folded square of muslin. The original toile pattern from that first dress, kept the way a sculptor might keep an early clay maquette, imperfect and useful precisely because of its imperfections. Next to the folded muslin sits a silver thimble, worn smooth on one side from years of use. The same thimble my grandmother gave me when I was 12 years old and first learning to sew a straight seam by hand. It is not an expensive object. It is not remarkable to anyone who does not know its history. But it sits there every day, catching a small line of afternoon light from the window. A quiet reminder that the things worth making are the things you are willing to make twice, for no one but yourself, with your own two hands. And your own name stitched somewhere only you know to look.